Let her rip!
Your fate is decided.
Game's up. Time's over. Observe! Your grand finale!
Illusions of destructions.
Shut up! Here goes!
Quietly now. Here comes the catch.
Flags up! And leap! Strike is one! Clear the area!
This one. Breaking shadow.
The character who is almost single-handedly responsible for all of the crazy tech in Natlan, a DJ and rap artist, and one bestowed with the ancient name Baraka as one of the 6 heroes of Natlan. We finally have a Xilonen Rerun, and naturally the big answer is yes, you should get her. It should come as no surprise that I hold a very high opinion of Xilonen, okay? She continues to be the Kazuha that heals. Now, I have defined her previously as the second strongest character in the game at the time, behind Farina specifically, and you know what? There is a good chance that ranking might be a little bit different today, but I haven't really looked into it myself, but the reality is she is still one of the tippy-top strongest options available at all times, in my opinion. Now, that being said, there has been some interesting developments in the game that have been giving some people a bit of pause towards whether or not they want to get Xilonen, so in today's video, I want to go through all of that as well. But first, don't forget to subscribe. Did you know that 90% of y'all haven't subscribed yet, so maybe you should do that, because when particularly cool characters like Iansan show up, I tend to end up doing an entire series of videos on them, looking at various interactions they can have with other characters, as well as some various team options. So hitting that subscribe button and ringing that bell does mean that you can be kept up to date with the latest and greatest videos on the channel. Now, enough yapping. Let's get into why I highly recommend Xilonen.
Make way for the bring it.
Start the charge! Justice o'clock!
Xilonen has 3 main things going for her that make her super good as a character to go for. So number 1, we have easy access res shred, as well as easy access damage percent with Peak Patrol Song. And then on top of that, we have some crazy Nightsoul interaction, as well as unbelievable healing, and of course the use of the scroll set. Now, Xilonen's easy access res shred was a pretty big game changer when she first came out, as it was often compared to using the VV artifact set, often by Animo support. The big difference is that number 1, you didn't need to actually specifically cause reactors in order to achieve this, and number 2, it actually lasted about just a little under twice as long as the VV buff. And it's the first point that I actually like the most, because there are a lot of teams where it just simply gets way too dank to get those setups in order to be able to double shred elements that you want. For example, most Vape teams, Melt teams, and even some Aggravate teams end up being prime examples of teams where trying to use VV to double shred just doesn't really work that well. On top of that, she shredded Geo, which automatically had the res shred just through using the Geo Resonance, so I guess that one wasn't particularly game-changing, but it was something that you still had access to. That's because the way her res shred works is that in teams with at least 2 Feck characters, Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, she just needs to EN2 and that's basically it. She starts shredding enemy resistance based exclusively on her Feck and Geo elements on the characters in the team, which means no matter who you're playing, so long as you don't have too many Dendro, Geo, Animo characters, you have that easy access res shred ready to go. That being said though, we'll talk a little bit later about how there may be a trend starting of characters that could potentially reduce the overall value of this particular part of Xilonen's kit, but suffice to say, Xilonen being able to res shred for her team, no muss no fuss, is just a really solid part of her kit. Now, meanwhile, we also have the Nightsoul interactions that she has in her kit. First off, I want to remind everyone that Xilonen's skill has 7 seconds as a cooldown. Do remember that. Now, the reason why that's important is because there's two things about her skill that are really, really strong in regards to Nightsoul mechanics. So, number one, if she's in a team with at least 2 Fex, she has her EN2 that will then raise her Nightsoul points all the way up to the 90, which is her cap, and then when she hits that cap, she consumes all 90, and therefore she actually has burnt 90 Nightsoul points. And then on top of that, when she actually hits that 90 Nightsoul cap, she also essentially triggers another Nightsoul Burst. Both of these are actually very, very useful. Now, the first one is particularly useful for any Mavuika players out there because Mavuika generates Fighting Spirit, which is of course her version of energy for her ult, and the fastest way to do that even to this day is by bringing Xilonen. Because Xilonen, as well as any of the Natlan folks, consumes Nightsoul points, and that is the fastest way you actually get that Nightsoul. And so with Xilonen draining 90 Nightsoul approximately every 7 seconds, if you want to be really militant about it, basically means she generates 90 Fighting Spirit for Mavuika with every use of her skill, who only needs a total of 200 at C0 for a fully powered ult. So 2 skills does the trick. Now, that's not to say that you rely exclusively on Xilonen's EN2 in order to make sure that you get all of Mavuika's Nightsoul points generation for her Fighting Spirit. At least in my experience, I tend to only use EN2 once with Xilonen's every rotation. So Mavuika's Nightsoul generation ends up being 90 from Xilonen, plus another 80 from herself because her own kit actually generates some Nightsoul, some Fighting Spirit as well. And then on top of that, there's maybe 30 coming from somewhere, maybe? Or I just take the L and it's not full power ult. It's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but it's something that's kind of nice. I guess it's just really a question of how desperate you are for that extra 30 Nightsoul points, but considering that we are in current time and someone like Iansan also exists, who I tend to bring for my personal favorite and personal strongest Mavuika team available at the present moment, yeah, even that's no longer an issue. Speaking of Iansan, this brings us to the second point that I mentioned, which is of course the Nightsoul Bursts. So usually Nightsoul Bursts are achieved by doing elemental damage, and they have a cooldown that is dependent on how many Natlan characters are on the team. The thing is, there's quite a few effects that can be triggered whenever a Nightsoul Burst occurs, so they usually are triggered up to once every 9 seconds if you have more than 3 Natlan characters, or potentially as slowly as once every 18 seconds. But with Xilonen's EN2, you get +1 Nightsoul Burst. Now, why is this particularly nice? Because, for starters, if we have anyone who is at least running 2-piece scroll, for example, that's +6 energy per Nightsoul Burst. And it doesn't have its own separate cooldown, which means if, let's say, for example, it's Xilonen who's starting the rotation, as soon as she hits someone, that's Geo damage, which is elemental damage, so that's 1 Nightsoul Burst, and then when she does her EN2, that's 2 Nightsoul Bursts, that's +12 energy for anyone who's running these scrolls set. Now, when I think of this particular interaction, I'm really thinking of characters like Iansan and even Citlali, who are typically particularly energy-hungry characters that tend to run scroll. Putting aside how you'd normally not want to use 2 scroll users in one team for a second, let's just put that aside. Xilonen's EN2 and the first bit of elemental damage basically means 12 energy. That greatly helps alleviate the ER requirements of these characters to the point where, I don't know, even someone as crazy energy hungry like Xiangling may find herself getting batteried a fair bit if she were to, I don't know, run a 2-piece scroll, 2-piece ER build. I don't know. That's a completely different discussion for some other time. But either way, from a quality of life perspective, this is pretty nice. Now, on top of that, we have quite a few talents that also trigger on Nightsoul Bursts. Now, some of them don't need the extra Nightsoul Burst from Xilonen to be fully functional anyway. We're talking about Mavuika's passive, Kachina's passive, Iansan's passive. But some can still benefit greatly from having the second Nightsoul around. In particular, there's 2 characters that I want to highlight real quick. The first one is Molani. With Molani, if you manage to get +1 Nightsoul Burst, that is +1 stack on her A4 passive, which is plus 15% more of her HP as damage on her burst hit. Now, the stacks only last for 20 seconds, so considering that the fastest way to even get a Nightsoul Burst normally is once every 9 seconds, it actually means that Xilonen is the only way you can actually achieve all 3 stacks and maintain all 3 stacks, which equals plus 45% of her HP as damage on her burst. So Molani's burst is already crazy strong, but if you actually run Xilonen, putting aside the whole red shred stuff for a second, you also get an additional stack of that, so her burst hits even harder. And then the other character actually is Varesa, because +1 Nightsoul Burst actually means plus 35% attack on her A4 passive. Now here's the thing, in a triple Natlan team, it is actually possible for a whopping 3 seconds to actually hold both stacks of this, because it actually stacks up to twice. But with Xilonen, you can actually hold both stacks together for a much larger, if not the entire majority, of the 12-second duration of her attack buff from her passive. So yeah, that's actually really nice. It's funny that this particular passive exists, because it really at the moment just screams, hey, you have to use Xilonen if you want to have full potential of this passive. I feel like this might be a very underrated part of her kit, honestly, so I just wanted to highlight this, because the Nightsoul interaction that she has is arguably one of the strongest in the game so far. However, keep in mind that especially when we're talking about things like Fighting Spirit from Mavuika, she is not the be-all end-all. You can definitely get away with Xilonen-less teams with Mavuika, especially now that Iansan exists, Citlali exists. You can still get close to, if not actually maximize her fighting spirit. So yeah, you should be a-okay in that regard. Now, the third thing that I feel like not enough people talk about is her healing. Her healing is crazy, okay? When I play Xilonen and I see her healing, I regularly am seeing like 9k ticks, 10k ticks, 12k ticks. That's crazy mode, and it's really fast ticks as well. Well, not the fastest in the game, because the boring one still has the fastest in the game, but slightly slower than those ticks. And it's still 12k ticks. Like, that's crazy, right? This is the kind of healing where, aside from HP scalers, you're bound to see your DPS character, even if they get smacked really hard and are nearly dead, immediately back to basically full health. So that's really cool. So if you're hoping to play her in a variety of super duper aggressive teams, you don't even have to worry, because once again, she's the Kazuha that heals. Hello, this is Kate, the editor. I just wanted to demonstrate the absolute power of Xilonen's healing to the point where she is, by my estimation, one of 2 single target healers who is actually viable in even Farina teams. So we can do something like this. There is like a little sort of delay before Xilonen's healing kicks in for someone like Farina. And even just like that, we've actually healed everyone in the entire team, and because everyone was super duper nearly dead, we of course maximized fanfare stacks, thus making Xilonen one of 2 single target healers who can maximize Farina's fanfare, the other of course being C4 Dory. Obviously, you'll probably still want to use a team healer with Farina. And finally, there is the scroll set. Now, the scroll set is a very strong artifact set, but it is a little bit finicky. You do need reactions in order to trigger the buff, and that's how we get into this sort of clunkiness that came with VV and also Kazuha in general. And this is kind of exacerbated by how clunky crystallized setups can be, because there is a global cooldown on crystallize, which does mean that double crystallizing is not really a thing that happens. At the end of the day, look, my personal recommendation, just run Peak Patrol Song and move on with your life. But either way, now that we have a lot of Natlan supports available, like Citlali, Iansan, or hell, even Auron as a way of using your Scroll artifact set, Scroll can be potentially a really good choice on someone else if you actually want to bring one of those other characters around. So at that point, yeah, this particular part of her kit is kind of slowly losing value, in my opinion. But either way, it's still a thing that she could do, and it's still really nice. So yeah, when you put it all together, Xilonen has probably one of the most plug-and-play kits of all time, especially for a support character. Her oops all effects approach to Red Shred, her direct impact on Nightsoul Bursts, and how she quickly turbocharges characters like Molani, Varesa, Mavuika. Look, all of this adds together to just a huge amount of really nice value. And even though we have newer characters like Iansan, Citlali that are starting to chip away at some of her value overall, there's still no one else that really just does everything that she can super duper easily. So at the end of the day, I just think that Xilonen is just such a super duper useful character, and this is like one of her strengths, simply how easy it is to use this character. There is another thing that I want to tackle with regards to Xilonen's value, and that's the potential trend of Hoyo creating hyper niche supports that can do what Xilonen can do, but actually a little bit better. And I am referring to characters like Chevreuse in Overload comms, Citlali in Melt and Vape comms, and leaks and spoilers, here we go, Escoffier in Freeze comms. Because it seems like, based on the teasing that I've heard, that having these characters basically means you don't need Xilonen in their respective team comps. You probably won't be bringing Chevreuse and Xilonen together because that kind of kills the purpose of playing a Chevy Overload team. You probably can replace Xilonen with Citlali in most Melt comps, especially ones with Garming and Mavuika, whilst providing barely enough Red Shred and, more importantly, the super duper valuable Cryo app. And this is ditto with Forward Vape Livalette. And Escoffier is kind of insane. For those who don't know, spoilers and leaks, here we go again. She is a team healer with even more Cryo and Hydro Red Shred, provided the team comp satisfies that, whilst also doing, from what I've heard, particularly good Cryo damage? Yeah, she's seemingly kind of busted. Something that I've heard TCs like Sir Jeff mention a lot lately is the way that Red Shred works, because once you have a source of Red Shred available, even if it's a smaller amount of Red Shred, yeah, any additional Red Shred becomes significantly less worth. So in teams with Citlali or Escoffier or even someone who could run VV, suddenly having Xilonen's extra Red Shred, not particularly useful. And with the exception of the VV users, who I tend to be the one replacing with Xilonen for quality of life purposes, these niche characters can definitely chip away at her value in those hyper-specific teams. That being said, I do want to offer an alternative perspective. You could go for those hyper-specific Red Shredders in situational teams, or you just get Xilonen and call it a day. In my experience, Vape Mavuika teams are already plenty strong, and even the Vape Mavuika team that I play is already plenty damn strong. Even though we can talk about power creep, let's put that discourse aside, because that's a completely different thing. I have yet to find a single piece of content where if I were to just run Xilonen instead of the hyper-specific niche support, mainly for Mavuika teams, I can't clear it. I have yet to find a piece of content where that is the case. I am perfectly fine clearing everything relatively satisfactorily whilst using Xilonen and not having to use, let's say, Citlali. And that includes things that I even clear without Xilonen because I'm actually playing with Aloy instead. So I'm probably still going to go and get Citlali anyway for other reasons, mainly because I think it's interesting to play forward vape with Citlali. But let me be clear. It doesn't seem like I actually need to get Citlali at all, especially for my Mavuika teams. So just having Xilonen seems to be more than enough. And at least for me specifically, leaks and spoilers again, here we go. Escoffier might not even end up being a particularly good character just for me specifically, because the only freeze teams I play are Freeze and Frenchloy. Maybe Skirk will end up being interesting enough that I'll grab her, but until then, the freeze teams I tend to play already have Kaz, mainly for the Bombler grouping, but as a direct result of that, I already have the VV Shred, so I don't really need Escoffier. Because using that same logic, once I already have that Cryo Red Shred from VV, that pretty much significantly reduces the value of getting Escoffier, at least for her Red Shred. So yeah, that being said though, this is of course another one of those teams where I wouldn't bring Xilonen because I already have that VV. So whilst it's true that we may continue to see a growing number of niche supports reducing Xilonen's value, I think at the end of the day, this is a gacha game. On the one hand, you could just get all of those super duper niche supports, which could potentially make your Imaginarium Theatre experience a lot smoother as well, by the way. Or, you don't spend that many Primogems, you just get Xilonen and you move on. Which way you choose to go is entirely up to you, but do keep in mind, the one thing that is stronger than having Xilonen is potentially getting Farina, but the other thing that's stronger than having Xilonen is having Xilonen on one side and a Red Shredder on the other side.
Control breathing. Start the clock. Light up the blazing sun. Incinerate.
Xilonen is one of those characters who, of course, has a place in at least one team with any and all future FEC characters. So whenever a new one shows up, chances are her value in this regard has already grown. Now, normally with these kinds of characters, I wouldn't really go through everyone who's new, but since it's not been that long since her release, let's actually go through the list of the new characters since her release. So let's start off with Autoron. Xilonen can be a fine alternative to someone like Sucrose in Taser comps, but you do, I guess, lose out on quite a lot of swell damage. Otherwise, Autoron can be a perfectly fine option in Mavuika Overvape teams, typically involving Xilonen as well, so that's entirely up to you. Of course, there are other reasons why you might not bring Autoron anymore in those teams, but that's kind of beside the point. Meanwhile, with Chaska, from what I've heard, no matter what, Xilonen ends up being a DPS loss compared to bringing anyone else. So yeah, you might not want to deal with that. Citlali, on the other hand, typically replaces Xilonen in melt teams and potentially even some vape teams, especially forward vape and Nivelette. That is, of course, unless you need a healer. Let's say because you're playing with Farina, in which case, yeah, that's not happening anytime soon. And then on top of that, we have Mavuika, as well as Pyro main character. As I've previously mentioned, Xilonen is one of the easiest and most versatile teammates for someone like Mavuika at the very least, for a variety of reasons that I've already discussed. Then we also have Lanyan and Mizuki. As far as I can tell, Xilonen is not useful in any of their teams. That being said, I'm not going to pretend to know what their teams really are. So yeah, feel free to let me know in the comments how you feel about that. And then we have Varesa. Now, like I mentioned, having that double Nightsoul bursting is really nice. So Xilonen can be a pretty solid teammate for someone like Varesa. I occasionally bring Xilonen in Varesa teams, especially the Varesa hypercarry team that I'm now playing. But otherwise, I tend to run Shen Yun and just move on with my life, especially if I'm playing with Farina, because then the VV part of Shen Yun actually works, and also the team healing does make her a little bit smoother. So yeah, we do have options, but sometimes I bring Xilonen, sometimes I don't. And then we have Iansan. Now, like I mentioned, probably my currently strongest Mavuika team is a Vape team with Xilonen, Iansan, and Farina. I found that Iansan's flat damage buff often ends up being more impactful for overall team DPS though, compared to Xilonen's red shred and damage percent, and I'm specifically talking about teams like Melt Aloy, where I have actually replaced Xilonen with Iansan until I get Xilonen C2, in which case all bets may very well be off. But also, I guess in content where I actually need the healing, then yeah, I would probably swap back Xilonen instead of Iansan, because Xilonen is just such a better healer than Iansan at the very least. Oh, leaks and spoilers again, one more time. Okay, so I suspect Xilonen is not going to find herself playing a particularly major role in Aoife or Escoffier teams, especially Escoffier for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, it's kind of pointless to bring Xilonen in that regard, so there we go. Either way, it seems like whenever a new character shows up, yeah, you could use her with them, like, you should be a-okay, but who knows, maybe the next string of characters that are showing up in the game is just going to be a whole bunch of animo characters that already red shred, stuff like Dendro characters even. Then you suddenly lose out on a team that Xilonen may or may not be part of. We'll just have to see.
Unstuck. Break a leg. Down. Letting great names echo.
So what kind of teams does Xilonen have? The answer is yes. So instead of going through every permutation and computation of every single team involving Xilonen, I just wanted to highlight the 3 team archetypes that I find to be my most favorite with Xilonen that I haven't already mentioned in the video. So let's start off with aggravate teams. See, Xilonen is, in my opinion, a godsend when it comes to aggravate teams, and that's mainly because you come across problems like Nahida's overwhelming Dendro, for example, which makes it really tough to consistently set up Electro VV setups, especially because it's hard to get that underlying Electro aura sometimes. But Xilonen's no setup required kind of red shred is just really useful in this regard. Especially if you decide to use Peak Patrol Song, all of a sudden you have one healer who is actually buffing all 3 DPS characters in the game. So that's really nice. So with teams like International or my various Cloran teams with a Dendro character in there, yeah, Xilonen ends up being really nice. Once I get that C2, oh, International is going to go crazy. Then there's also various Geo teams, be it with folks like Navia or Ningguang or hell, even Noelle. Xilonen has been a really solid Geo sort of teammate for a lot of those Geo carries, so long as you at C0 or C1 only limited to just 2 Geo characters on the team. Now, what's great about Xilonen is that with her skill, once you dash through an enemy, she's actually really good at also battering characters like Noelle. So that is really good. She actually generates a pretty solid amount of energy. And so in either a Navia team or a Ningguang team or a Noelle team, I have been using Xilonen like a battery sometimes as well, which is really good. And then of course on top of that there's also DPS Xilonen, which is of course a real team. It's not a crazy meta team or anything like that, but if you enjoy kicking people and you want to play Xilonen on field a little bit more, then DPS Xilonen is a team that can play. And on top of that, you would actually have a reason to play Kachina. So if you like Kachina, this is probably the only team that I could potentially recommend for you. Now, you can use Mavuika over Yelan if you want in this team, since there's plenty of Nightsoul to play around with. I feel like it's just a little bit finicky to line up scroll buffs while still maximizing Mavuika's nuke at that point, so I personally still kind of prefer running with Yelan. Things probably will get crazier when I go for C2 Xilonen myself, mainly because then we can start looking into triple Geo teams as well, because that is actually an option if you happen to use C2 Xilonen. That being said though, Xilonen will just stop healing, but I mean if you're playing triple Geo and you're playing with Noelle, that part is just not even a problem. And finally, there's another team that I want to talk about, which is the Double Pyro Vape team. Specifically, the Arlecchino Mavuika Vape team with Yelan, because this team actually works really well. Now, I have actually tried this team with both Xilonen as the healer and Iansan as the healer. And even though Iansan does provide a much stronger buff for Arlecchino's DPS specifically, I get the feeling that at the end of the day, you're probably doing a bit more DPS with Xilonen, mainly from a team DPS perspective, because Xilonen is then buffing both Yelan and Mavuika as well, 2 characters who, off-field, they're actually still doing a pretty decent amount of damage. So it's definitely something to check out, because once again, we're having Xilonen provide the Red Shred that pretty much buffs all 3 DPS characters, and if you manage to get the Pyro Crystallized, then you're also further buffing both the Pyro characters through the scroll set, so that's really nice. And on top of that, because Xilonen actually heals everyone really quickly, with the exception of Arlecchino, of course, versus the Iansan, who only heals a little bit slowly. Yeah, at least in a pinch, there is also that particular thing that is really good with Xilonen. And once again, any reading of Xilonen's C2 is going to easily indicate that it is an absolutely insane constellation for this team, pretty much giving all 3 DPS characters precisely the buffs that they like. Obviously, these are going to be some of the teams that I play Xilonen in, but at the end of the day, everyone who has Xilonen probably ends up just playing her in a variety of the most wackiest random teams anyway. I'm sure you're playing a bunch of teams that I haven't even thought about. So let me know in the comments what teams you play Xilonen in.
Settle down.
The Temple of Wisdom.
Silence be sanctified.
Bring it! Look alive! Yeah! Ah! Yeah! Ah! Yeah! Ah! Ah!
Bow your head.
Grow.
Buckle up!
Silence.
This may hurt a little.
Okay, let's start off with support Xilonen, because that's what 99% of y'all are going to end up playing anyway. When it comes to her weapons, at the end of the day, there's about 4 options that you really need to think about. The first one is, of course, a Peak Patrol Song, which is her signature weapon, and in my opinion, I actually think her weapon is actually worth it, mainly because that way you can just very easily get the damage percent buff that you want, instead of having to rely on scroll and finicky reactions and all that jazz. So well, I'll talk about that in a second when we get around to artifact sets. Meanwhile, a handful of Xilonen users also run Freedom Sworn instead. So instead of the damage percent buff, you get a different kind of damage percent buff, but then you also get some attack percent as well, which can be very nice. Otherwise, the rest of y'all are probably going to be running Fav. 99% of non-5-star Xilonen players are probably just sticking to Fav anyway, because energy. It's really good. But on the off chance that you somehow don't have Fav, there is Flute of Epitzel, which does give you a whole bunch of defense, so at the very least that does improve your healing. Keep in mind that when it comes to the main offensive part of Xilonen's support capabilities, they're not stat dependent, like, at all. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, most of the time, you're probably going to be running Scroll on Xilonen. You will pretty much get really good buffs on it, but just keep in mind that in order to get these buffs, obviously you need to do reactions. But the reaction that you're going to be relying on is going to be Crystallize, which has a global cooldown. So, as far as I can tell, double Crystallize setups, not really a thing. I have seen some videos online claiming to be double Crystallize setups. I'm not entirely convinced that they're really double Crystallize setups, and they certainly involve a bit of a delay in the use of your skill at the very least, so they're a bit finicky if you ask me. You also can't trigger the 40% scroll buff with just using Xilonen's ult. You will only get 12% if you actually just use her ult and forget to use a skill. What you need to do is you need to go skill into ult, well, I guess something like that, or at least you need to trigger the Crystallize after you use your skill, because that way you go into Nightsoul, and when you go into Nightsoul mode, then you can get the full 40% scroll buff. Now, if someone else is on the team is also using scroll, for example, Iansan, Citlali, keep in mind that double scrolling doesn't actually mean anything. The scroll buffs don't stack. So the alternative that I've been hearing a lot lately is, of course, okay, Petra on Xilonen, or if you're lazy, there is always Noblesse. TLDR scroll's fine, but, you know, some people probably might consider just getting Peak anyway, like me, because it's just a huge quality of life bonus, honestly. Just out of my own personal sheer laziness, I think I'm going to be perma-locked on Scroll. And why is that? It's mainly because of those artifact stats. So, when it comes to artifact stats, the big question ends up being what weapon you're using on her. If you're running Peak, like I am, you actually want to try and get at least 2865 defense on your build before any additional buffs, including the sword, including Xilonen's passive, and all of that good stuff. But at the end of the day, just build as much defense as you have past that mark and as much ER as you can, and you're pretty much A-okay. So it's actually really easy to get to that 2865 mark of defense. So because of that, just playing an ER defense healing hat pretty much can provide you with everything you really need with Peak Patrol Song. Otherwise, you could try and get more healing by going defense healing. Or if you're desperate, you can go triple defense. You're probably missing that healing cup then. Otherwise, if you're running Favs, then obviously crit rate is king. Just get as much crit rate as you can. A crit rate hat is pretty much a mainstay. Otherwise, defense and defense cup, you're pretty much good to go. For all other weapon options, it actually doesn't matter how you build your Xilonen. So I guess the only thing left really is to just maximize your healing without worrying about what weapon you have. So I guess defense healing is the way to go, or hell, ER defense healing, just depends on how you want to play it. Meanwhile, there is another way to play Xilonen, and that's DPS Xilonen, like I mentioned before. And DPS Xilonen is honestly even easier to build because you have less weapon options, and you don't have to think too hard about how you're going to build her. So, Peak Patrol Song and Uraku Misugiri are the 5-star swords that, as far as I can tell, actually perform very similarly. It just depends on what the rest of your build actually looks like. Otherwise, Flute of Epitzel is pretty much your only viable 4-star option as far as I can tell. The artifact set that you're using is going to be Obsidian Codex, because Xilonen actually drains Nightsoul points ever so slowly, whilst using Obsidian, which actually does give you the 40% crit rate buff. And you could potentially use Husk if you're desperate, I guess. Artifact stats should pretty much be defense, geo, crit. That being said though, because there's potentially a scroll buff in the works, and potentially Yelan or Mavuika, for example, if you have a particularly nice looking defense cup, you may want to try that against your test dummy of choice. Generally speaking, it's not hard at all to build Xilonen. She is probably one of the most straightforward characters to build as well. So that's also another reason why I think Xilonen is just really, really nice.
Quick as a flash!
Let's ride! Pyroclastic surge!
I wanted to dedicate an entire section to Xilonen's Constellations, specifically because I feel like they're a little bit underrated, and also on top of that, some of them are actually really hilarious. Now, that being said though, before we begin, Xilonen is like a lot of 5-star characters. You absolutely do not at any point in time need any of Xilonen's Constellations. At C0, Xilonen is already absolutely fantastic, okay? Let me be very clear, you don't need any of Xilonen's Constellations. That being said, first off, C1 is often considered worthless by a lot of people. I'm here to say it's not. Let me explain. As a start, it's actually a really nice exploration buff, but I'm sure a lot of people don't really care about it being an exploration buff. They want to see what you can do with it from a DPS perspective. The way you normally play Xilonen, being support Xilonen, yeah, it's not super duper useful. I mean, there is the interruption resistance, which is kind of nice. It's not a gigantic amount of interruption resistance. Some enemies can still knock you around a little bit, but I have noticed the difference between having it on versus not having it around. So it's nice. I mean, I actually sometimes make use of it when I'm playing Clorand or Nivelette. So there we go. Otherwise, there is one thing that's kind of nice about C1, which is that if you're a DPS Xilonen player, as a start, you can play DPS Xilonen for longer, because that's basically what that C1 is all about. Your Nightsoul Blessing, you start off with more points and your drain is slower. And the full Nightsoul Blessing duration is also longer as well. So that's nice. Yeah, C1 is not entirely worthless, in my opinion. It's not something you would actively go for, but it's not something that you probably should be too worried about getting. Because then there's C2. Now, night and day, there is a difference between C1 and C2. C2 is the hilarious one, if you ask me. It is a variety of buffs rolled into one constellation based entirely off your team comp. Now, first off, keep in mind, each character is only getting the buff that is associated with their element, okay? Unfortunately, you cannot get a Mavuika with a crit damage buff, plus a damage percent buff, plus an attack buff. Oh, that would be pretty insane. Secondly, all you have to do is just activate and manage your source samples to make sure that they're consistently on. And as long as they're online, you're pretty much getting the buffs. So that's really, really nice. The Geo source sample is permanently active. So if you're playing a triple Geo team, you don't even have to do anything. You already have both the Red Shred and the C2 buff pretty much ready to go. Only in the double Feck teams do you need to use your skill, do EN2, and then just activate them as you normally would, okay? And thirdly, this is a team buff, which means it's not just your active character who's getting buffed, it's everyone who's getting buffed. So that is, generally speaking, quite a lot of damage that's being provided by Xilonen. Now let's go through each buff. The Geo buff is plus 50% damage, so it's just free damage. Like I mentioned in mono Geo teams, yeah, you don't even have to do anything, and you suddenly get 50% free damage. That's it. I suppose it might be a little bit diluted in its effectiveness in the team with like Noelle, because Farina tends to be part of that team. But hey, it's free damage, who cares? The Pyro buff is plus 45% attack. Now this is fantastic because there's quite a handful of high base attack characters in the Pyro series. Mainly Mavuika, Arlecchino, hell, Diluc with a Wolf's Gravestone. Very high base attack indeed. So you could potentially be seeing upwards of plus 400 attack, just straight up. Hell, even plus 450 attack straight up. It is, of course, going to be a slightly diminished effect if you're running attack buffers like the famous Iansan or the even more famous Sara. So, you know, it's just something to keep in mind. The Hydro buff is plus 45% HP. Keep in mind, there's actually not that many plus HP buffs in the game. The only other one really of note is the, what is it? It's Yelan C4. So, considering that you don't have Yelan C4 probably, At least you can potentially get Xilonen C2 and you can get the same buff. Now, keep in mind, it's for Hydra characters, but Tortellini, DPS Boulder, Ayato players, yeah, you guys got shafted. Sorry. It's mainly designed for DPS Kokomi, Nuvalet, Farina, Moalani players. Yeah, you guys are finally becoming viable, especially Nuvalet players. For too long, Nuvalet has struggled to do any DPS, but with Xilonen C2, he may finally be ever so slightly viable. Meanwhile, we have the Cryo buff, which is plus 60% crit damage. This is the C6 Sara buff, but for Cryo DPS characters. Now, there is a YouTuber by the name of Red Warrior who has C2 Xilonen and has played with C2 Xilonen for quite some time. On YouTube, he has made a pretty good point, which is that this buff is not necessarily as strong as you may immediately think it is. Mainly because Cryo DPS characters tend to have something like Blizzard Strain available, which basically means their builds tend to end up being oops all attack, oops all crit damage. And I know this for a fact because that pretty much describes my Freeze Lloyd build, right? I'd rather get the attack buff from the Pyro set than potentially getting the crit damage buff from the Cryo set. I think I end up with more damage at that point. And even if your Cryo DPS isn't using Blizzard, they're probably playing, you know, with Mother Chaussee because their name is Risley. And so it seems to me that a lot of the Cryo cast probably won't be able to make use of the plus 50% crit damage. That being said though, counterpoint, we do have some Melt characters that can actually use this, specifically Aloy in a Melt team, because you're probably not going to be playing with Blizzard, you're definitely not going to be playing with Mother Chaussee, and you're definitely not going to be playing with Obsidian, because Mavuika didn't come with the oops, everyone can use Nightsoul mechanic that I was hoping that she would come with. So as a direct result of that, generally speaking, Melt Aloy builds probably won't be seeing giant amounts of crit damage, and in a similar vein, Melt Ganyu as well. So in those builds, yeah, the plus 60% crit damage is probably going to come in real handy. And then finally, my favorite one, just by reading it, the Electro buff. It's regenerate 25 energy, and then any ongoing burst cooldowns just suddenly go down by 6 seconds. This is the one I really want to try out. In fact, this is the only reason why I even want to get C2 Xilonen in the first place, is just for this Electro buff. I couldn't care less about the other buffs. Even if it was just exclusively the Electro buff, I would have gone for it myself. Because this one, in my opinion, is probably the most hilarious buff out of all of them. There's plenty of Electro characters that are pretty energy hungry. Lisa, Miko, Iansan, A, these all come to mind. A, not so much, because obviously she can battery herself, right? And then, of course, you have some Electro characters that do some really funky things when it comes to their energy pools, namely Sethos and Varesa. So this buff could end up resulting in some crazy shenanigans like rapid fire ults for Electro characters. Let's say, for example, my international team with Lisa and Miko. Oh, rapid fire ults, let's go. I'm so excited for this one. All of this to say, at the end of the day, C2 Xilonen is 100% a stopping point. Meanwhile, C3 is skill levels, C5 is ult levels. That does mean more res rate with C3 and more healing with C5, unless you're playing DPS Xilonen, in which case you have more ult DPS, which is kind of nice. C4 is the... Oh, actually, even with C3... No, C3 doesn't actually increase your DPS in DPS Xilonen, because the kicks as part of DPS Xilonen are tied to your normal attacks, so C3 doesn't actually increase that. Alright, now we have C4 Yunjin, which is a... Oh my god. Alright, now we also have C4, which is a Yunjin-style flat damage buff, but only with 6 ammo, so it's a little bit short, but it's tied to her skill, which, again, only has a 7-second cooldown, so it's not super duper restrictive. It's actually kind of nice. The ammo is separated for each character on the team as well. There's not that many teams that I can think of where you would be able to like use one character, go through the ammo cycle to the next character, use all the ammo, with the exception of international. But aside from that, yeah, you're kind of out of luck in that regard. And then finally we have C6, which is just standard Omega DPS Xilonen. Basically the idea is you get Mavuika's infinite Nightsoul mode for 5 seconds after you use your skill, and then do a dash or do a jump or do a kick. In that 5 seconds, your DPS also shoots up, and you also get to do some team healing, which is kind of nice. It's not massive amounts of team healing. By my estimation, it's about 3x 3k team heals thereabouts. So it's still nice because again, it's tied to her skill. So once it's all over, you kind of just have to burn your Nightsoul points or swap, I guess, and then 7 seconds later you just do it again. So there is that. So yeah. Xilonen is already beyond crazy at C0 in my opinion. Her Constellations will just make her even more insane. Obviously C1 is just a comfy quality of life buff for DPS builds. Her C2 is hilarious for specific team comms. And then her C4 and C6 just turn her into more of a DPS character. So you don't need her Constellations. But for real, I think if you decide to get her Constellations, they might be a lot more fun than they are necessarily just like DPS buffs.
And have the courage to be afraid.
Right now. Emerge. Right now.
Is it my turn now? With these rising flames. Now that's more light.
Let the mountain flames boil. Emerge.
With the fall of darkness, destruction shall rise.
You're
Have
in
a
for
taste
little
of
shot.
purgatory.
I'm always watching. Right here.
With these rising flames. Not bad. You've proven to be
Come
a
a
worthy
little
opponent
closer.
after all.
Surrendering right now. Right here. Emerge.
My blade is all that remains.
Committed to memory. Right here. Emerge. This may be
Sometimes only the beginning.
We finally made it to the end of the video. I hope it's as clear as day that I heckin' love Xilonen and what she can do. She's been a really well written character in my opinion in the story, and she's an amazingly designed character as well, and on top of that she's really strong. So this is why I feel like, with some extreme exceptions, I think you should get Xilonen. You at least try to get her, especially now that we know that photos on Constellations are also on her banner. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. How do you feel about Xilonen after all of this? Let me know in the comments. Oh, this is one hell of a video to edit because based on the recording, we're currently reaching about an hour. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you liked this video, hit the like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.